Thank you all for being here. It's a very big day and a very big week. And as many articles have pointed out, one way or another, climate change is on the ballot. The outcomes of this election are likely to be determinant to the outcomes of our efforts to successfully address climate change. So in this episode of Let's Talk Climate, we'll explore the 2020 election and help us decipher our best path forward. We've been having nonstop casual conversations about the election for the past couple of days. This one is official, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts, Michelle and Jerry. We are being recorded. And Jerry, let's just start. Besides the polling errors, what insights do you have into this election?
Well, I think that it demonstrates that we know less about the attitudes of the general public than we realized. Polling errors are one thing, but if we cannot reliably ascertain things like how one intends to vote, it's pretty hard to believe that we can reliably understand public opinion in all sorts of different dimensions. And I think we can see that in the climate space. I mean, a lot of climate activists have spent a tremendous amount of time investing in changing public opinion and marshaling public opinion to promote climate action. And it's very hard to reliably do that when we cannot confidently state what public opinion really is on really important things like how you intend to vote. I mean, a great example of this was the South Carolina Senate race, right? Lindsey Graham and Jamie Harrison were supposedly running neck and neck. And the electoral count, if my memory serves, is that Graham won by 12 points or something along those lines. I mean, that is stunning. It tells you a lot about the limitations of our ability to understand the attitudes of the American public.
It seems like that's all been since the Trump era. If you go back, 3 or 4 presidential elections, a 3-point difference was huge. Now they're off, 6 points, 10 points, the Bradley effect or whatever. Do you have any insights into why it's so far off?
Well, it's really difficult to say. I mean, I've read some narratives from pollsters about how it's very hard to get representative samples when your cell phone tells you who's calling in advance, right? So people who are not particularly interested in talking to pollsters have an easy exit now that they necessarily didn't have in the past. And that's going to skew the samples that you get. I'm a little bit skeptical of the shy Trump voter narrative, but I am not skeptical of the shy minority Trump voter narrative, which could very well explain why it is that people have been caught off guard by the strength of the Latino vote for Donald Trump. But circling back to brass tacks with regards to climate policy, it seems to me that there's probably more reason to be hopeful about climate action in the next Congress than most people probably think. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, Republicans are on record, at least notionally, supporting a major infrastructure package, right? Well, Infrastructure Week will actually occur now if Joe Biden does indeed win the White House. And one can imagine a lot of green energy build out in that package. And remember, a lot of the green energy investments are occurring in red states. So it's not obvious to me why someone like Chuck Grassley or John Cornyn would necessarily oppose that. Now, of course, if it's offered as a down payment on the Green New Deal, it won't happen. But one can certainly imagine some very positive things there. As far as stimulus is concerned, one could imagine the Build Back Better project that Joe Biden has. Maybe has to go through some adjustments, and it probably won't be $2 trillion. But I could imagine major expenditures there as part of stimulus. And as far as innovation is concerned, Republicans are increasingly telling the story, including people like Donald Trump near the end of the campaign, that climate change really is a thing that we need to address. Republicans would prefer to address it without burdening the fossil fuel industry or American consumers in any way, shape, or form. And that means innovation. So could you imagine a world in which a bipartisan deal for a major splash on energy innovation and R&D were to occur? I could certainly imagine it. The near-death experience that Susan Collins faced in Maine and that Lindsey Graham faced, and at least looked like he was facing in South Carolina, doesn't necessarily suggest to me that they're going to be quick to go into lockstep with an absolute opposition strategy out of Mitch McConnell. I could certainly imagine, especially with Lisa Murkowski up on the ballot in 2022 and other moderate Republicans, that enough Republicans would be interested in those conversations to make transpartisan deal making a reality on the climate front.
Well, it's, getting gestalt on the prior topic, it's amazing to me that all of the errors have been on the errors that favor the Republicans. If you take a look at every state and the 10.6-point difference, it's all shifted to the right. So there is something that's going on that's not a general polling error. I think it's something, but I want to thank you for bringing it back to the topic at hand, which is climate, right? And in this election, all the polls had Democrats running at 1, 2, or 3, Independents 5, 6, 7, and Republicans a little bit less. But it looked like it was going to be the first big presidential election on climate. I didn't really see that much impact, if any. What about you?
No, I don't. And in fact, you can see it elliptically by looking at the turnout numbers, right? There were less young voters in this election than there were in 2016. And the narrative that we had been hearing a lot lately is that climate was a critically important issue for Gen Z and for the millennial vote, and that they are increasingly engaged on that as a matter of life and death. And they didn't come to the polls. So no, you'd have to work really, really, really hard and squint very tightly to find evidence that climate was particularly relevant in this election. That doesn't mean that the prospect for climate action is off the table, because I think a lot of us forget that politicians move legislation and move policy initiatives without necessarily being prompted to do so by public opinion. You can see it in the First Step Act, the criminal justice reform bill that was passed during the Trump administration. Was there and this was before the George Floyd incident, right? So was there massive public support for that? No. Was there Republican support for that? Not. There was, amongst a lot of Republican elites, including places like the Charles Koch's operations, right? But there was no mass, drive in the Republican Party to promote climate action, or excuse me, to promote criminal justice reform. But we got it nonetheless.
Well, so, the election might have, if those young people came out and voted in strength and voted for climate change and made a difference, that might have changed the way some politicians look at climate change. But, given the fact that the election's so close, do you think that the election has changed influenced anybody's thoughts on climate change in any way at all?
I think it might. I think it very well might have. I mean, even though the Republicans held the Senate and picked up some seats in the House, apparently. Of course, these are provisional conclusions. It may very well be the Democrats do take the Senate at the end, but it looks like that's fairly unlikely. Republicans, regardless, understand they have a problem in the suburbs. And that didn't change with this vote, right? I mean, it's not as if there was a reversal of Republican fortunes in suburban America, or at least with college-educated white voters in the suburbs. So that's a problem they know they have to address. And that was affirmed once again in this election. It explains why Kevin McCarthy has put together a couple of dozen Republicans on the House side to talk about meaningful, or at least what they purport to be meaningful climate action. And that's not going to change. The real issue is, can they do enough on the climate front to gain political capital or not? Because if they can't, they're going to have to invest more strongly in climate action to accomplish their ends. But if they can just, invoke innovation fairies and throw small ball bills out there and cover themselves in greenery sufficient to navigate elections, that's probably as far as they're going to go. Personally, I'm skeptical they can get away with that play, but we'll have to see.
Michelle, welcome. Thank you for your persistence in connecting here. And before we jump in with specific questions for you, just top line, what's your takeaway from the election? What it means to climate? What do you think's going on out there?
I think we're witnessing something absolutely historic. Joe Biden getting the most votes. over 72 million of any presidential candidate in the general ever. Beat an incumbent president. I've only seen that 2 other times in modern history with Clinton and Reagan. He helped to inspire record turnout. We're looking at 159 plus million voters, highest voter turnout rate since 1900, which is pretty incredible. So it's a change there that I think is really good for democracy, correlates with increased equity in access to the vote because of the mail-in voting. We had at least over 100 million ballots that were cast during the early vote period. And something that really is exciting and important for climate, vastly increased youth turnout. So yeah, I mean, we had a lot of talk after 2016 that we were looking at possibly permanent realignment of the electoral map with and a breaking down of the blue wall in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which I took seriously. I live in Michigan, but it turns out not to have been true. You know, Biden and Harris have won Wisconsin, Arizona. In Pennsylvania, we're getting near parity. Believe that with the remaining ballots coming in, that Biden is going to win in Pennsylvania. So, yeah, I think there's realignment happening via the Biden-Harris campaign, and Mark Kelly decisively winning that Senate seat in Arizona. So time will tell if this is permanent, but demographics are on the side of the Democrats, right? And I want to say here in Michigan, we flipped the Supreme Court, which is a really huge deal. And there's a lot of successes, like at the local and at the state level, ballot initiatives, the tax measure on the North Slope oil production in Alaska, and in Miami-Dade, we now have a new mayor who actually ran on the Green New Deal.
Cool. What did you think about how close the election was? Did that surprise you at all?
So I had been predicting a closer election than many, but you know, the polling was wrong, and the industry needs to figure that out.
Yeah. Jerry, do you want to jump in and make any comments on what Michelle said? I do want to, say that, Trump got more votes than he got last time. Biden got, there's just a greater turnout. So there's more people out there voting. And I personally, didn't think that the pollsters could be that wrong. I've been in this business for a long, long time, and it's almost inconceivable that they across the whole swath of them going on, somebody's going to make a lot of money figuring out just exactly what that was and how to get an algorithm to adjust it. Jerry?
I thought the election was fascinating, and I didn't take away many of the lessons that Michelle took away. So, for instance, how do you explain the increased Latino vote for Donald Trump? Well, the main way you could, and the uptick in Black support, especially among Black men. The reason I think is relatively clear. We are in the early stages of ideologically sorting out minority voters, just as we saw ideological sorting hit white voters about 30 or 40 years ago, right? Conservatives are joining the GOP, liberals are joining the Democratic Party. And it turns out that in Black and Latino communities, they are just as ideologically heterogeneous as whites. But the party's ability to hold them regardless is framed for various reasons. One, this is now a more polarized and ideological landscape, which increases the gravitational pull of the GOP for conservative minority voters. And secondly, the social sanction that has long existed against, say, Black votes for Republicans is degrading as more Blacks are integrated in society, fewer of them go into churches where a lot of that social sanction can be found. And that's not good news for the Democratic Party. In fact, it really undercuts the idea that realignment is possibly in the cards. What's interesting to me is that despite all of that, you saw white college-educated voters increasing their run to the Democratic Party, and you saw non-college educated whites increasing their loyalties to the Republican Party. And if you look at those sorts of electorates, what does it suggest to you? Well, over my shoulder is a campaign poster for Nelson Rockefeller in 1968. I'm describing to you the Rockefeller Republican Party, which is what the Democratic Party demographically is starting to look like. That doesn't necessarily, set anything because, well, if the Republican Party is a white working class party, explain to me why it's got plutocratic economic policies. We know the narrative about why that is, but it's not impossible to imagine a Republican Party that decides that there's political capital to be gained by actually delivering for its constituents, right? Josh Hawley and Marco Rubio and Tom Cotton are already smelling that kind of political play. And what happens when the Democratic Party realizes they're essentially the Rockefeller Republican Party of the 1960s and 70s? How is that going to change their commitment to working class issues and the place that the Sanders faction has within that party?
I have some personal experience down with Florida. My daughter lives down there, and just talking to a couple of Hispanic people down there that I know, and talked to one lady, and she said she voted for Donald Trump. And I said, why? Because it was surprising to me. And she said, well, the people that are coming across the border now are not like the people who were coming across before. And Donald Trump is taking care of the economy, and we need jobs. And she sounded like a Republican. But then I talked to her a little bit more, and I said, where'd you get the information? And it seemed to me like the Republicans were out there 6 months before us targeting certain groups with some spectacular marketing that kind of had enough time to meme its way through that sector of society and become. So I don't know that the African American, and Jerry, you could very well be right, but I think it was supported by some great targeted marketing by the Trump administration. There's so much mendacity and so many lies out there that you have a hard time believing that the president of the United States of America can get on television and lie to everybody. And so I think there's I don't want to call it a bully pulpit, but there's some credibility that comes with the office no matter what. But we have to get back to climate here for a second. Michelle, before I jump in there, do you want to comment on the last 3 minutes of discussion?
Yeah, and also something I think I heard when I was trying to get my computer to cooperate and get on this call. So I just want to say hi to Jerry and hi, Bob. Good to be here with you today. I think I was hearing something about how the Senate's going to go. But we really think that we're headed to 2 runoff races in Georgia, which will put the Senate at 50-50, with Chuck Schumer in charge of setting the agenda. So good possibility that not certain. So that picture is not as settled as, it's not definitely a Republican Senate. But, and I think I can engage with what Jerry was saying from a climate perspective. The picture is a little more, quite a bit more complicated, of course, than we've been hearing. There was excellent Latinx engagement and organizing on the ground in Arizona, and there we see Democrats doing very well. It was Wayne County and Detroit that, and also indigenous communities and Anishinaabe communities in the Upper Peninsula in Michigan that made a huge contribution to making sure that Michigan went for Joe Biden. So, and then there's the youth vote, and of course, youth are increasingly, Black, Indigenous, Latinx people of color. So it's a very complicated picture, and I think it'll become clearer, as we dig into the numbers of the next bit. But I think too that climate. Joe Biden was the climate candidate in this election, and the Democratic Party is the climate party. We've not, when Trump's State of the Union hit, the way he addressed climate was, without ever using the word, was to talk about planting trees, which is a good thing to do, but does not in any serious way address the climate crisis. That's not the kind of leadership we need. Whereas with Joe Biden and the Democrats, we're getting a really ambitious climate plan, the most ambitious climate plan for a presidential general election candidate in history. And it's a climate plan that addresses environmental justice issues, which are, the fact that climate and environmental harms disproportionately impact communities of color and under-resourced communities, working families of all colors. And the Joe Biden's climate plan calls for 40% of federal investments in climate and energy to go to those communities. I think that's really huge, and is a place that around which, along with the green stimulus plan and building a green economy with millions of good union jobs, that has already made huge inroads for Democrats and will continue to do so.
You know, I'd like to tell that story, Michelle, but I'm not really sure I can. I mean, even while I embrace ambitious climate action, Republicans can easily tell themselves the story that the energy and climate issues worked in favor of them, not against them this election. They held on in Texas. They made it a nail biter in Pennsylvania. They way outperformed the polls in Ohio. And they brought this election to a standstill with how close it was, picked up seats in the House, held the Senate. It's not obvious to me that the climate issue worked against them. You heard more about the Green New Deal by far from Republicans than Democrats. Why? It was an attacking issue. I was skeptical of the ability of the fracking issue to work in Trump's favor in this campaign, but it looks like it may very well have. I mean, I will no longer ever again, I swear to God, ever trust another survey or poll. So exit polls, I'm not repairing to them, but the fact that this is as it seems to have been as tight as it was in so many of these races, particularly in Pennsylvania, suggests to me that you would have to work hard to find a story that would tell you that the climate issue gave significant political capital to the Democrats writ large in this election. I wish that were the case, and maybe it's true, but finding the data to support that narrative is going to be very hard.
Well, here's a piece of data. Fox's own exit polls found that 70% of voters nationally were supportive of strong climate action. So I think trying to read all these numbers, you're right. These are early days, right? And we're going to be diving into things much more going forward. But you know, Biden is winning, and he closed strong on climate. And we are seeing other climate environmental wins across the country. Not to mention, there's the youth vote, which is huge, but also, you know, climate donors. We saw a huge amount of money being donated specifically to Biden by people from the clean energy from Biden movement. And the volunteerism, with tens of millions of phone calls and texts being made by organizations like Sunrise and Sierra Club, and Democratic environmental caucuses across the country, both for Biden and then also for down ticket candidates.
Well, okay, so there's a lot of statistics out here, and when somebody says that the youth vote was at a record level and somebody who says that the youth turnout was low, they can both be right. As a percentage of the vote, youth turned out less in 2020 than they did in 2016. So there was many more youth, but they turned out as a lower percentage of the vote than they did this time. But, you know, sticking back to the climate thing, there's a spectrum, let's call it the Green New Deal, where it's a giant solution for many social issues, for healthcare, for unemployment, for energy, great. And then there's an infrastructure bill, Jerry, where we started out the conversation where you're going to dump some extra money and build, you know, some insulate buildings, build some cheaper electric cars, you know, do a variety of things to do that. We need to cut emissions by 50% each decade going forward. And I didn't see enough in this election to build a lot of momentum toward that need to have a very powerful bill coming out in the next 3-6 months. It's going to move this country forward. And so my take was that this election might have slowed the initiative for big time climate solutions, and half measures are going to kill us. So what do we do about that?
Yeah, I think you're right, but I would reframe this a bit differently. I was always skeptical of a big climate bill of the sort that a lot of climate activists have been trying to promote ever getting through, regardless of how this vote went. But that having been said, the boundaries of what is possible will either be established by moderate Republicans or they'll be established by scared stiff moderate Democrats, which means the Green New Deal was never on the table to begin with, and it never had a shot. The sort of climate policies that are going to be possible in the next Congress are those that hit that sweet spot. And while it's not sufficient to invest in innovation and R&D to address greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, it is a necessary, if not sufficient, thing to do. So we could at least use 2 years to launch a very meaningful investment program, or building out the grid and clean energy infrastructure is critically important. It's not sufficient in and of itself, but it's necessary in the course of things. We can tackle that as well. And then see what happens in the 2022 election. Beyond that, I think that a carbon tax is not necessarily off the table, mostly because there are moderate Republicans who behind closed doors have been waiting for an opportunity that might allow them to actually forward something like that. Now, that opportunity will exist in the next Congress. Will they go forward with it? I don't know. But if you could find 3 or 4 Senate Republicans to do that, you've got a majority in the Senate. Because I imagine even if a lot of Democratic climate actors think a carbon tax is an insufficient response, they're not going to oppose it if that's the best they can pull out of the Congress in this session, especially with Republicans rediscovering the need for fiscal responsibility and re-embracing the austerity of their souls, which is going to become an obsessive issue in the Republican Party. One could imagine a carbon tax and revenue used from that as a deficit reduction measure to some extent.
Michelle, should you want to jump in or should I?
Yeah, well, I'm going to agree with Jerry on something. Yeah, I mean, I think that getting investment for R&D is a sweet spot legislatively. I'd really like to see a lot of R&D going toward, storing renewable energy, ways to improve our grid quickly, and agriculture, which is way too. And so we can look at how small sustainable organic farming can help. Look at perennial cereal crops. There's a whole host of things. I'm a farmer, so I won't get too much in the metaphorical or literal weeds here. But so I agreed on that. But there's also with President Biden a big opportunity to act through executive actions. So even if we have a Republican Senate, Mitch McConnell is, I call him the king of obstructionism, but there's still so much that President Biden can do. The council that I chair, we and others are in the climate community would really encourage him to declare a climate emergency on day 1, which unlocks a lot of statutory powers for him to move forward, and then work on undoing the 100 plus Trump era rollbacks of key environmental protections for air and water, which were accomplished through executive actions and so can then be reversed. And then rejoin the diplomatic era efforts. We formally left the Paris Agreement yesterday. And the Paris Agreement was not enough. It was modest to begin with. And the science, as you know, has advanced. We know climate change is proceeding faster than we thought and accelerating faster than we thought at the time it was created. Nevertheless, he can lead the world to commit to the lower target in the Paris Agreement, 1.5 degrees Celsius targeted change, and with the US doing its fair share on emissions. And he can also act to protect our public lands through executive action. An example of this is directing the Secretary of the Interior to end new fossil fuel lease sales and permits and put a ban on new fracking on federal lands and waters. So there's a lot. And then there's the appointments, right? People are policy. So, a Biden Treasury Secretary or SEC chair could make it a lot easier to pressure big banks and investment firms to take the risks of fossil fuel investments more seriously. So there's a lot that can be done, whatever happens in the Senate.
Okay, let's
Well,
see.
I mean, I think that's true, but I think there's more serious limitations to this than a lot of climate hawks suspect. So undoing the rollbacks is easily enough executed. So that and getting back into Paris
Good.
is certainly doable. But if if you talk to Bob Perciasepi and ask him why the Obama climate initiative was as modest as it was, he'll tell you that it was largely because our lawyers thought this was the safest way to navigate through the court system. Anything more ambitious would have been extremely difficult to pull to bank on surviving litigation. Well, we all know that the Obama climate regulations were very modest. The oil and gas industry projected they would have zero cost because natural gas prices would be low enough and market penetration would be great enough for gas to meet the standards without having to restrict emissions at all. In other words, they were a business. It was more or less a business as usual scenario. Now, imagine a world in which the Biden administration, a forthcoming Biden administration, wants to go further. You will be in court for at least the better part of that 4 years before those regulations can go into effect. And it's not obvious with a totally Trump-packed judiciary, and especially packed with people who are more enamored with Federalist Society narratives about the limitations of the administrative state and administrative law. It's not clear to me that executive actions like calling for a climate emergency would ever survive these Trump judges.
Well, I've got a bunch of questions here from the audience that segue into the things that we're talking about here. But when we talk about the rollbacks, there are things that are still in agency regulatory processes. There are things that are still in court. There are things that have gotten out of court. The biggest thing that Trump might have done is just decide not to enforce the rules on the books. So there clearly a lot of stuff is going to be able to come back, but any new things have got to go through the same regulatory processes and legal challenges that Trump has faced with everything that he has done. So I think my rough guess is 2/3 of the rollbacks will be able to get back reinstated relatively quickly, and a third of them, maybe half of those, will never get back because no one's going to go through the effort. But but if Jerry, you're been a little negative on the prospects of a new administration coming in. And without the Senate, it's going to be a much bigger problem. If we had the Senate, it would be fantastic. But and I say we, I mean climate people. I'm not identifying myself as a Republican or a Democrat. I'm invite all of us on this call are people who care about the climate. So, Jerry, what do we do?
Well, environmentalists and environmental activists need to stop talking to themselves, and they need to start talking to Republicans. As difficult as that may be, it doesn't mean you necessarily have to learn Russian or Ukrainian to talk to them, though it might help. But climate actors need to be far more serious about building up political infrastructure in the Republican Party, which they have not. I mean, the amount of money that the climate community spends on engagement with Republicans and trying to find votes and support there is like flint in a pocket relative to the massive sums that are invested elsewhere. A great example of this was the other day in the Atlantic. We learned how Jeff Bezos was spending his climate money. $100 million to this organization, $100 million to that organization, all the usual advocacy suspects on the Democratic left. You could give them $1 million, and it's not going to make any difference to Lisa Murkowski or Tom Tillis or people like that, right? I mean, you need to invest in finding those that support out of that kind of community. It doesn't happen overnight, and there's no guarantees you're going to get it. But imagine a world in which you could count on Mitt Romney, Lisa Murkowski, Tom Tillis, Susan Collins, and maybe a few others I shall not name because we have, conversations which need to be kept confidential on the Hill to advance climate action. You could absolutely do that. So I think that's to the question of what we do. Well, that's your answer.
Well, I don't know that that's an answer that solves the problem, though. Try to engage in this polarized world where nobody's getting along well. I wouldn't consider it all that realistic that we could, what we just did, what progressives just did to Susan Collins, if they're going to go back and now try to make friends with her. I don't know, how well that's going to work. But
that's the job for people like me, not you necessarily.
but still, we have got to cut emissions by half this decade, and there's ways to do it. And massive investments in infrastructure is certainly part of it. Regulation is certainly part of it. And some of us were hoping that we would have the House, the Senate, the presidency, and whether or not it's called the Green New Deal or package at the neat Green New Deal, any environmental climate solution is a solution for justice. It's a solution for equity. And now, if I hope your scenario that it's 50-50 and we've got Kamala in the Senate to break a tie-breaking vote and we can make something happen. But there are some Democratic senators that might go the other direction too. So we've got issues. But what is the path forward for us if we want to try to have emissions by 2030? Have half as many emissions. I just can't see the building the relationships with a few Republican senators necessarily paying off. But Jerry, maybe you can convince me.
Well, if you had a $40 carbon tax, regardless of how you use the revenue, put that aside, because how you use revenue from a carbon tax is an entirely separate matter. We can have our own preferences, but put that aside, consider that a political matter for another day. But if you had a $40 carbon tax, along with investment in green energy and grid infrastructure, according to virtually everybody who crunches these numbers, that $40 carbon tax, increasing at a modest amount above inflation every year, would be sufficient to get the emissions cuts we need in the next decade. The narrative that they are not is a narrative that green energy is nowhere near as economically competitive as people like me or Bloomberg New Energy Finance might tell you, or Jigger Shaw might tell you, or Bob, or you might tell people, right, Bob? I mean, to me, the mystery of progressives increasingly turning against carbon pricing as a policy ideal, even if it's not politically achievable, but that remains to be seen, is that green energy simply will not displace fossil fuels at those prices. Well, we already see them displacing fossil fuels without the carbon tax, right? I mean, green energy is eating up the fossil fuel sector, and you're beginning to see the oil and gas industry looking a lot like the early days of the collapse of the coal industry. I mean, look at the hemorrhage in market cap that ExxonMobil's gone through. And it's not just ExxonMobil, and it was happening before the pandemic as well. So to me, if you want what's the path forward, my ideal is to figure out a way to translate ExxonMobil support for a carbon tax and BP support for a carbon tax. If big oil is going to support a carbon tax, at least that gets you a foot in the door so you can talk to Lisa Murkowski and talk to John Cornyn. And make a deal maybe. Now, of course, Cornyn ran against the carbon tax in his Senate campaign. So that's going to be a little bit of a lift for John Cornyn, having used it against his opponent in the race.
Michelle?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in there. So I think, we need to remove the fossil fuel subsidies. We're going to, if you're going to make a market argument, billions of dollars in subsidies every year to the fossil fuel industry. Fracking industry hasn't been profitable for more than a hot second, basically without those subsidies. And so we do that. And then how about we hold the corporate polluters responsible, and also hold these companies that have been lying, engaging in purposeful disinformation to the American public for 4 decades. They knew about the climate crisis. Hold them responsible, hold them financially responsible, like we've held big tobacco and the big pharma responsible. I realize there's the problem with the courts, but it is a path forward that makes a lot of sense. And certainly getting rid of those subsidies is a really big and important first step, and one that Joe Biden has committed to. In terms of a carbon tax, I mean, you need to get the Republicans on board, and we're just not really seeing signs of that happening. Not even with the Baker-Schultz proposal, which would hamstring the EPA for 10 years, which is not a really good deal. So I'm really not optimistic about a carbon tax. And then, of course, there is the political feasibility side of it, and there's the environmental justice issue involved. Allowing companies to pay to continue to pollute some of the most polluted environmental hotspots in this country, which are predominantly Black Indigenous, and Brown people, there's a real moral and ethical issue, and it's just wrong in my view. You need to get away from seeing that as some sort of sole solution. And I also just don't think the Republicans have shown no sign of getting on board. If that's what they want, they should be out there taking some leadership. But I want to get back a little bit to this idea of that, Joe Biden's committed to, which is having a global summit. He can indeed use the bully pulpit internationally and nationally to talk about this. And it's one of the reasons I'm so encouraged by the way he centered environmental harms, climate harms, making sure that we're all listening to stories, the actual lived experience of the people and communities and states that are so terribly harmed. On my 40 acres of my farm, we haven't harvested a crop in 3 years, directly for reasons directly related to climate change. And there are other farmers, business owners, families that have been hurt far worse.
Well, okay, so I'm trying to get to climate solutions with the new administration. What can we do that's going to get us anywhere near to cutting our emissions in half? And there's a lot of ideas here, the infrastructure idea, the R&D, innovation, all good stuff, price on carbon, engaged Republicans, lots of stuff. But realistically, there's a reason why the Democrats in the Inslee plan and the House plan and the Senate plan and the DNC plan, nobody has a price on carbon. And they'll mention it on 2 pages of a 350-page report. They'll say it would be nice, and if it happens, it's okay, but they don't push it. I don't see ExxonMobil pushing, they price on carbon. Yeah, sure, they'll give $1 million to CLC and say, hey, go for it, and then they can tell everybody that. But they're not lobbying for it anywhere around the world. I don't think I think the fact that ExxonMobil has announced that they're going to increase their emissions over the next decade is a good indicator that they're really not on board with this climate solutions thing quite yet.
No, you're not at all wrong about that, Bob. And it's important to keep things in perspective. I'm not particularly optimistic about the prospects of carbon pricing in the next Congress, but I don't think the chances are zero. They're non-zero. They might be low. They might only be very modest at best, but it's a potential pathway. We need to grow up and realize that whatever is possible in the foreseeable future is not going to happen without Republican support, at least legislatively. And so the question is, how far can we bring Republicans, and what policy vehicles will they get into? Now, we deal with them up on the Hill all the time. I can tell you that one of the most important reasons that nobody has flown a carbon pricing flag in the GOP, save for Francis Rooney and Brian Fitzpatrick and a few other House members. Carlos Curbelo did it before he was retired in the 2018. The main reason you don't see that in the Senate is there's no realistic pathway for that legislation to get signed by Donald Trump. And all you're doing is incurring the wrath of the Koch army and Grover Norquist and everybody else. You gain nothing from it. So to even begin the conversation realistically with a member, you need to tell them how this is going to, what kind of where the window of opportunity is. That's not to say that there isn't some support for the idea. It's just they don't see a way to get over the prison wall without being shot by the guards. Now that's different now with Joe Biden in the White House. So can you imagine a world in which those deals are cut? I could imagine them. I'm not saying, I'm not predicting them, but I think it's possible. But the reality is that the alternative scenarios, like the bill that came out of the Democratic Congress this year, the nearly 1,000-page piece of legislation, that's just porting the California regulatory policy to Washington. How many Republicans are going to support that? None. I mean, it's just not going to happen. They're going to call that the Green New Deal with 10,000 bureaucrats and run opposition to it. So if not carbon pricing, and it may not be carbon pricing, then what? Well, the conversation is all about how far you can take Republicans, because you're never going to be able to do this legislatively without some meaningful GOP support.
Well, okay, so we don't have an answer to my question yet here. I would love to be able, if we assume a scenario, Michelle, do you think that the Democrats are going to get balance in the Senate, or do you think there's a chance for that?
I do think that there's a pathway for that. It is not certain, but there's certainly a pathway.
And Jerry, do we have this?
Will make a huge difference. But I just want to go back. I wouldn't underestimate what can be done with executive actions working in concert with, Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Labor, and so on, who are Biden appointed and who are seeing things through that climate and environmental lens. I think it can be very powerful. We have seen for the last 4 years how powerful executive actions can be. And also, calling for the world to come together with us. And the third piece of this is we have a climate movement that is big and is growing. And we are seeing nationally that, as we have since the civil rights era, that people out in the streets, people demanding change, it can make a difference. And we need to be out there supporting Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in accomplishing the climate plan that they have put forward. Not saying it's going to be easy, but we don't have a choice, which is, I think, part of what you're getting at, Bob, right? Like,
I mean, if we want to save the planet, I've got 3 beautiful new little grandkids, then they have, redoubled my energy for this whole thing. But, and I'd love to be able to, and Michelle, I do think replacing all the agency heads and the 5,000 bureaucrats that are going to change here in Washington, D.C. in the next 3 months, if this election goes the way it looks like it's going right now, all of those people will be way more committed to climate change than the other group. And every little nook and cranny, will it be? I'm totally into the international stuff. Price on carbon on top of everything. I spoke to one of the Democratic nominees, or not nominees, candidates for president, and I asked him, why doesn't he support a price on carbon? And why didn't anybody seem to support it? And he says, this is a long haul march. It's nothing that's going to happen in the next 2 years. We're not going to solve it. So what we need to do is we need to hold on to Congress and the Senate for at least an 8-year period of time if we want to get a foothold here. And if you go out with a price that's going to be perceived as a tax increase by the Republicans, with a price on carbon, that you're going to get yourself booted out at the midterms, and everything that you work to do is all going to go away, right? So, but one of the things that hasn't been mentioned here at all is jobs. And Jennifer, thanks for bringing it up. Jennifer Roberts is in the audience here. It seems to me that we have a lot of momentum already, that if you take a look at utility scale and energy being built in America today, this year, 2020, it is all renewable. The amount of fossil fuel stuff that's being built doesn't even replace the stuff that's being retired. So the whole world is already shifted there. We just have to increase our ambition and do it twice as fast, right? And then I'd love to get the Republicans engaged, and Clear Path, and Jerry, your work, and some of these other people are just a beacon of hope that we can get something done. I'd do whatever you'd say to, if it could help move that forward. And I think that that's where we should kind of move this toward a close, is that for all the people on this call, what do you recommend they do to support a transition to a rapid transition to a clean energy economy? What should, heads of a lot of different organizations on this call, a lot of people on this call, what should they do?
Well, I do not believe policy change follows from protests, demonstrations, and marshaling of public opinion. There are a lot of people who think it does, and there are some political scientists who will tell that story, but most political scientists won't. Whether you're looking at Marty Guylands at Princeton or Matt Grossman at Michigan State and their work, they find there is zero correlation between changes in public opinion and changes in public policy. Public opinion can stop things from happening. It can put boundary lines around what can be achieved, but it can't force change. So, I mean, if it could, we'd have gun control, right? I mean, 70% of the public supports gun control, but we don't. Why? Because public opinion does not directly translate into policy change. So these are, first of all, and most importantly, political acts that we need to engage in. Reducing your personal carbon footprint is all well and good, but it's not anywhere near sufficient. These require political actions. And secondly, I think we need to more seriously recall that to see our way to decarbonization It cannot be done simply through executive action unless you're going to postulate the Democratic Party is going to hold the White House till the end of time, because administrative acts can be undone. They can be reversed. Huge damage can be done that way, right? You do what you got to do for the time being. So I'm not against administrative action, but also remember it takes a lot of time. We are on short time. So how long did it take from the point in which the New Source Review Act standards, which were in the 1992 Clean Air Act, actually applied in the economy? More than a decade. Why? Because there was nothing but legal wrangling from industry until all the way through the course of it. We don't have the time for that kind of litigation, right? Not if we're trying to meet decarbonization goals. So it means we need to engage in political action, and it means we need to find a legislative agreement that can bring in the GOP. As difficult as that might be, if the Republican Party never buys into climate action, it will never be stable enough to do its job.
Michelle?
So I think,
Jerry, you disappeared, by the way, just so you know.
there you go. You know, I think there are three things that we can focus on. As individuals, join a climate environmental justice group and volunteer, donate, help them do that outreach to, you know, a lot of Republican and independent voters actually are strongly for addressing the climate crisis, and also Democrats. So that's crucial. And I think also those groups can continue to work on the state and local level. I'm a former county commissioner. We're doing in my county some really important work, and there's lots of that happening around the country. Nothing is stopping that from happening, and we need to make sure that we're holding all, you know, talking to all of our elected officials at all levels. They can all impact this from school board on up. And I think I'm working on the Senate to maintain and improve on what I hope and believe will be, Democratic Senate this time, 50-50, and improve on that in 2022 is crucial. And supporting President Biden in achieving his bold, ambitious goals in every way that we can. The council's focusing on this. There's 41 states that don't have state Democratic Party environmental caucuses. So we're helping to build that out, to build up that support from the state and local level up.
Well, this has been a very interesting conversation. It's very intense. I do think that there is an answer out there. I do think we all have pieces of it. You know, Jerry, I think that the innovation and investment and all the things that Republicans seem to be supporting, they're doing a lot more on climate change than I think that a lot of the progressive people give Republicans for. So I think we have to thank a small cadre of groups that are out there pushing the party in the right direction and having some success with that. So that's heartening. I do think that all technology is here. I think that's heartening. I do think that the Biden administration can be a really huge catalyst if they decide to do it, if they make climate change a top priority and they walk the talk of the election and really, and then we get back to us. And I think that if all of us, she needs to do everything that we can. We need to exemplify smart decisions and smart opinions on climate change and spread those around to build support at all levels for climate action. So we've got about 3 minutes left. I'm just going to give you each 1 minute to say whatever you want to say in closing, and then we'll look forward to rushing off and seeing what happened in the election while we were talking here for the last hour.
Michelle, why don't you go?
Go ahead.
No, after you.
Sure. I just talk a little bit about the Climate Council. You know, we intend to work hard with the transition team and the Biden administration to make sure that Joe Biden's plan is achieved, working with our congressional allies to build power for climate action in Congress, the green stimulus, making sure that we're having good union jobs as the renewable energy sector, which is in fact growing so fast. That can be a huge way for us to come out and rebuild as we have to out of the pandemic. And building our outside coalition of state environmental caucuses. And I think what you said, Bob, about our, making sure that we in these organizations that are represented on this call and ecoAmerica, Jerry's organization, mine, we need to keep listening and need to keep sharing the climate stories, how people are impacted, and listening to the story that honestly the planet is telling us and amplifying that as we go forward, to build support among voters and so they can pressure our legislators and support our president and the legislators who are already working on this. And thank you so much for having me.
Okay, don't go away quite yet, Jerry.
You know, the final thought that I'd offer is that there's tremendous support, at least notionally, in the corporate community for climate action. There's virtually no meaningful support on Capitol Hill from the from the corporations who signed those encyclicals and joined these organizations and put their names on these open letters on Capitol Hill. It's absolutely stunning. If and when those people in the corporate community who have declared their support for climate action were actually to lobby to that extent and condition their political support for Republicans with support for climate action, that would change a lot of things. The GOP is many things over its entire history, right? But the one thing it's always been is the party of business. The reason the GOP does not listen to the corporate actors who sign on to climate action and sign big pages in the New York Times is because they just see this as kind of like woke greenwashing to keep progressives off their back. Well, if and when they ever thought otherwise, if, for instance, John Cornyn was in a conversation with the head of ExxonMobil, and the head of ExxonMobil conditioned their support for Cornyn with his support for a carbon tax, and allegedly that's what ExxonMobil believes we should be doing, well, that would be very meaningful. But the fact is, it isn't happening. It would also be very meaningful if the clean energy industry acted like the major players they are in state politics. So it bewilders me why they don't use leverage on people like Chuck Grassley in Iowa, where the wind energy industry is huge, or why don't they use it on John Cornyn, where the solar and wind is huge in Texas. It's a mystery to me, and I'm not saying that corporate support would be in and of itself sufficient to break this logjam, but it would sure as heck be helpful. And I'm tired of never seeing it, despite a whole lot of self-proclamations from corporate America about what they think.
Another good part of the solution. Well, we're at the end of our time here. Great conversation, a lot of intrigue, lots going on. Thanks so much, Jerry and Michelle, for joining us, for all the work that you're doing on climate in so many different ways. You're both inspirational to me, and I want to thank all of our listeners. Join us or subscribe to the ecoAmerica YouTube channel to watch these episodes, and turn in December 10th for our next live episode, which will be bringing America together on climate at 2 p.m. Eastern on December 10th. And subscribe and follow us with our newsletters on the websites to stay in touch with everything that we do. And thanks again to everybody in the audience for being in this fight and taking the time to join us and become more effective at winning it. Onward. Bye, everybody.